Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have the Ontario election post-mortem. Now, before I begin, I just want to address something because people have been asking this question regularly, and I thought I would just answer it promptly. I'm not going to do a federal update until mid-March. I want to wait for the wave of polls post-Liberal leadership race ending. Those won't be, I think, the most settled. I think the early April polls will probably be the most accurate ones. But we'll see. And this is not just being like, aha, will be better or worse for whatever party. There's a lot of chaos right now because this not just the Liberal leadership race, there's all the stuff with Trump and Ukraine and all that other stuff. So there's a lot of noise going on. I'm not 100% certain on them. But with that, let us begin the video. And with that, I want to shout out my channel members. Really appreciate the work you guys do and supporting my channel. And now let us begin. So this is what the actual results look like as of time of recording on Sunday, March 2nd. This is what my final forecast I published was. This is a bad one. Do not do great in this particular cycle. Now, what's even worse than that is it wasn't even just like a clean overestimation of the PCs. Like, I also overestimated the Liberals in like these seats, but overestimated them over here, and like, it's not great. It's not great. But there is a couple of reasons why this has happened. So we're going to go into start with the post-mortem Excel spreadsheet. Everyone's favorite spreadsheet, isn't it? Don't we all just love spreadsheets? I hope so. You see a lot of them on this channel. Okay, I'm gonna zoom in a touch more. I hope that is reasonably readable. So this official number is what the current number as of reporting is, 124 seats. Overall, if I were to take a naive polling average, this is what the polling average number is. In this column here is mean squared error. Mean squared error is a means of calculating how much error you have in a statistical model. There's many types, but this is my preferred type because basically it penalizes larger misses. Another really common one is mean average error. Sorry, not mean average error, is mean error, or perhaps average distance is another possible one. I don't like those ones as much because missing every party by, or like, let's say there's 5 parties, right? You miss each party by 0.2. I think that's less bad than missing one party by 1 point. Or, one party by half point and one by half a point kind of thing. So, that's why I use mean squared error here. So, if you take the raw polling average, you get a mean squared error of 1. But it's not great at seat hit rate. And that makes sense. Raw polling is not very good at predicting seats because a lot of subtleties and things happen. You got to do, that's why my model started existing. And then you have my model in this election. I don't have a very good seat hit rate. It's only a little better. My mean squared error is dramatically higher. I will note, a mean squared error of 1 I think is like an A grade. If my model gets a mean squared error of 1 province-wide, that's an A. This would be like a B. Something like this, if this was not province-wide, like these would be like a C. This would be like a D down here. And if you go look at, I don't have any worse ones. But anything above like 25 would be like an F. Your model sucks. Or really failed. So my performance is not great, and like your A plus would be sub 1, mean squared error. So this is not great by any means, but there is a couple of factors that affect this that are not entirely my fault. So the first one, and this is perhaps the biggest difference, the biggest source of my error. There's really 3 sources of error that have occurred here. So the biggest one is historically parties over or underperform polls. And historically, the NDP has underperformed polling. There's very, very few elections where they overperform polling. In fact, there's really just a couple polls in 2022 and a couple of polls, and these are final polls for the record, back in 2014, where provincially the NDP overperformed. And your average poll, they underperformed. So, and similarly, the PCs and the Liberals tend to overperform the polling historically. But as we see here, this is the raw polling average. The PCs significantly underperformed polling, and the NDP significantly overperformed, and it was actually the Greens who did also significantly underperformed. So that kind of miss is amplified in my model. So not only is the raw polling off because of this kind of over-underperformance, my model's expecting that to happen, so it actually exaggerated that. So it is an issue with how I do some things that this is a risk. And this is a risk I'm normally willing to take because it allows my model to correctly predict elections in Alberta or Saskatchewan, where you see these like 10, 15, or like up to like 5, 10-point poll misses. And I correctly predicted Saskatchewan and Alberta in the last elections in both those provinces. I correctly predicted the U.S. election because, again, they see the U.S. Trump has similar size polling misses that consistently happen. But then, when you have a situation like we just had where everything goes topsy-turvy, my model exaggerates that and it completely blows itself up, which is not great. There's not anything I can really do anything about that. That's just a methodological choice. And to all my viewers, that's how I do things here. Sometimes I will get amazing picks like the U.S. election. I think that's probably that's going to happen more often than not. But every now and then I'll get ones like this one where my model blows up because it exaggerates a trend that's wrong. Now, the second of the 3 factors here is this is relating to seat hit rate. Is that the NDP vote did not collapse in a normal manner. In a lot of circumstances, what happens, you'll see, is if a party's losing support, they lose support pretty uniformly. The PCs gained support this election from 2022, and it's a pretty uniform change. So if we go here, this is like the swing differences. So you look province-wide, they gain about 2 percentage points over 2022, give or take. And it's pretty smooth. Like, yeah, the South is a little lower. Yeah, the East is a little lower. But it's pretty smooth. They gained ground uniformly everywhere. And if you look at the NDP on the high level, they lose ground uniformly everywhere because they do actually do very poorly in this election in like objective terms. And yeah, they're doing a little bit better in the North, or a little less bad in the North, and a little more bad in the GTA. But where this gets really misleading is it's actually really not smooth. Because if you look at the seats where the NDP won in 2022, you look here, in the East, in the GTA, in the South, they actually have gained vote share. Not just votes, vote share. And if we go to just the raw vote view, they gained votes in all, on average, they have gained votes in every seat that they previously won in 2022. And they lost votes in every seat, more or less, they did not win in 2022. So you get a situation where the NDP gained 50,000 votes in seats that they had previously won, and they lost 224,000 votes in seats they previously lost. Whereas, I didn't bring up the numbers for the OLP or the PCs, but they're not as exaggerated. That's a pretty uncommon circumstance. Now, I think if I were to do this, the OLP has this to a little extent, but the OLP only has like 8 seats in 2022, so there's not much data. You can't really go make a big, bold claim on 8 seats. You can on 31. 31's a good sample size. So what we see here, like, the NDP loses nearly 7% vote share in seats that they previously lost. And they gain nearly 0.6 in seats that they won. So one of the things my model does, because my model, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. My model at its core is a proportional swing model. That is the core basic thought process. There's several different core methods to modeling you can do. And they're not right or wrong, they're just different assumptions. But the very, 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 very core to my model is a proportional swing. Now, I could do, there's a couple other ones out there. There's relative swing, which is very similar to proportional swing, but not quite the same thing. There's an absolute swing, etc., etc. At the core, though, mine's pretty close to proportional swing. There's some more complexities around it that I'm not going to talk about because trade secrets, but at the very, very, very core, it's a proportional swing. So if the polls are saying the NDP is losing ground everywhere, my model's going to say they're losing ground everywhere. And normally that's fine. But when you have a party like the NDP that apparently has very, very strong either incumbents or very, very strong local brands, that's not a good assumption anymore. And there is a very strong inkling in this election that there has been a lot of strategic voting involved. A lot of strategic voting. Because the actual turnout and actual number of voters this cycle is very similar to 2022. There's slightly more voters, but that's because the population's a little larger. But otherwise, it's basically the same number of votes. But the NDP's lost vote share, but they've lost raw voters. So they've only lost voters in seats they can't win. And most of those voters seem to have went to the OLP. So going forward, and this is kind of what this version is doing, I'm going to make some adjustments, and I'm going to propagate this federally. I'm going to try to systematize this, but there is like less sophisticated ways to do this that also work, but there's also more sophisticated ways to do this that are better. But anyways, I'm going to do some adjustments, especially for parties like the NDP right now. But I think generally speaking, the whole left right now, where there is going to be a stronger degree of strategic voting modeled. So in other words, essentially what I'm going to try to be going for in my model is that seats where the NDP previously won they're going to do better than average, but seats that they didn't previously win, they're going to do worse than average. And same thing with the Liberals, and same thing with the Greens. And if I do a very crude version of that, it's not as sophisticated, but it's a good approximation of what I'm going to attempt to do algorithmically. I did it as a trial version, because whenever you're doing this kind of stuff, by the way, like there's this common thing, the Python Excel dichotomy. It's like, what everything you want to do in Python, you can do in an Excel spreadsheet. And eventually it's too annoying to do an Excel spreadsheet, so you do it in Python instead. So I'm just trying to systematize it by doing it practice runs with this cycle here to then translate it into an actual formula. But if I do this kind of strategic voting math, what we get is closer to this. Now, this does reduce the PCs a little bit because I also did a few other weights. There's one other note, too, that I made. This is just a very, very small blunder. But the very small blunder is I labeled some incumbents wrong. Like, I labeled Oshawa as an incumbent for the NDP. Sorry, for the PCs, which is wrong. It's not going to be a huge difference. It wouldn't have changed the results of the seat. But, like, it's still a mistake. And so this is also correcting some human error as well in this Bagel Model Plus. So correcting the human error mistakes and doing this kind of strategic voting decisions, we do get a little bit better. We're still not great. Mean squared error, that's higher than I would want. But there's a reason for that, which I'll get into. Well, partially because polling is bad. Like, you can only do so much better than polling. But the main thing is it actually boosts up the seat hit rate significantly. It's about 5% better. And now that's not perfect, but again, like if we scroll down here, like you look at something like the North, and this is factor 3. The polling isn't uniformly bad. So the polling in like Hamilton, Niagara, some of this is implied polling, by the way, because not all pollsters report this, but I can do estimates. The polling in Hamilton, Niagara, that was really good. That was like A+ level polling. In the South in general, it's a good polling. 1.4%, or sorry, 1.4 mean squared errors for a regional is really good. Regionals are going to do higher error than the province as a whole because the sample sizes are smaller. So there's more noise. And again, the GTA, the polling did quite well. But, well, you see the problem here. And I didn't fully deploy the strategic voting math of Liberals. That would probably boost the Liberals here a little bit and drop the NDP again here. But I digress. It's not fully ready. I'm going to try to deploy it federally before the next update. We'll see. But the big thing here, there's 3 big regionals where we're missed. So the Central, it's okay in the raw polling. GTA, Hamilton, and Niagara South is really good. In East, the polling is bad. We are missing the Liberals by a mile here. Like, that's a very, very, very large miss in the East. And that's exactly why, if you look at this, you can see that the Liberals are winning places like West Neophene. And they're winning, and the NDP's winning. Oh, sorry. The NDP's winning Ottawa, West Neophene. And the Liberals are winning Neophene. Like, that's why that's happening. Because the polling is significantly off in that region. But the 2 big ones that killed my seat hit rate, and you can really see it here with these percentages, is the North in Toronto. And you look at the North, and you're seeing a ridiculous 20-point mean squared error. The NDP's off by almost 8 points. The Liberals themselves are almost off by like 7 points. The strategic voting math would have probably caught this. Because the Greens and the PCs in the North are doing okay. But the OLP and the NDP numbers are completely off. And when you're talking about something like the North, and you're saying, you're losing, the NDP's down to like 24 points, they're not going to do very well. So just to give you a comparison here, like, this is what the actual 2020-ish results were like. So, in reality, the NDP only lost about 2 percentage points from 2022. Which is perfectly reasonable. That makes sense. But the polling was saying they lost nearly 9, nearly 10. There's not much you can do when the polling is saying you're going to lose nearly 10. Like, that's going to kill my model's hit rate. And in fact, actually, my model does do better than the raw polling in this region a little bit. And it does even better when I try to do the really basic version of strategic voting calculation. The really, really basic one. I'm not sure how big of an amplification this will end up being, so don't assume that this kind of difference is what we're going to see. I'm not really deployed it yet, but this is an approximation of what I'm going for. And then you get a similar story in Toronto. This case, though, the PCs are given, again, nearly 7 points more support than they actually get. And the NDP's off by 5, and the Liberals are off by a bit more than 4. And we bring this up here and we look at Toronto. That means the NDP's only lost a few points, and then when you factor in, they lost almost all of those points in ridings that the NDP did not previously win. And then you get complete misses with seat counts. Now, this does lead to an interesting question here. Why are the polls in, say, Toronto, why did they miss this much? That's a huge, colossal miss. So, and similar question in the North. And perhaps a similar question in the East. The East and Toronto, I think, have the exact same problem. And that is Ottawa, and that is Toronto. Not necessarily the rural East, per se. So what's special about the cities of Ottawa and the cities of Toronto? Well, they have a lot of people in those cities who live in apartment buildings and condominiums. Apartment buildings are bigger for this, but condominiums do matter too. And a notable thing with residents of those two types of buildings is they are a little harder to reach by polls, especially apartment dwellers, because apartment dwellers tend to be a little poorer and they move a lot. And moving a lot makes it very difficult to assess what to do with a voter. I'll give a really a really extreme example from my own polling, for my Ontario election, the Ontario election here. I had actually two different people. If you were in the audience below, congratulations. You caused me a headache. Who lived in Quebec, I suppose, in the last federal election, voted for Bloc Québécois, now apparently live in Ontario, and are voting for a different party. Because they obviously can't vote for the Bloc Québécois in Ontario. That's a really complicated question. Like I said, that's an extreme example because they can't vote for the Bloc here. But let's say they moved. Let's get into a good example. You lived in Toronto St. Paul and voted Liberal last time, and then you moved to Toronto Danforth and are voting NDP now. That's going to look like a Liberal to NDP defector in Toronto Danforth to a poll. And that's a misleading because it's actually not. That is literally what's happening, but that's not actually the best way to model how things are going. It's complicated, but these are some subtleties to this. So what happens here is there's just a lower response rate from apartment dwellers, and there is a systemic miss that occurs here because they don't. It's hard to figure out how to address those voters properly in polls because they move more than the average person. And voters moving at all is complicated. So that's a big problem one. And then in Ontario, Northern Ontario, the reason I think why you get this big miss here is a similar story. A lot of the voters who vote NDP in the North, Indigenous voters being the biggest individual group, but also there's again a lot of blue collar, a lot of poorer people who don't respond to polls very often. I mean, I can just show you my own data on this. If we go here, by my quota, I'm weighting this towards census data. Households that make under $150,000 should make have 192 weighted voters, but I got 71. Now I'm weighting it, so it should fix a little bit of it. But again, weighting only fixes so many problems when it comes to data like this. Because in this sample of actual 71 raw, sure, I weighted it up to 192, but if I have the margin of error is acting like a 71 sample, not a 192 sample. So that means the margin of error is 11 here for the PC specifically, which means there's a lot more noise, and it's more likely that the poll could just be not wrong, but not right. Because technically speaking, if the poll is within margin of error of the actual result, it's not strictly speaking a wrong poll, but it's not the right poll. To give it, that makes sense. And that's where one of the complexities come in. So overall, just to not mince my words here, so people don't accuse me of this, I didn't do very well in this election. It happens. I mean, statistically speaking, I should get 1 in 20 wrong. Anyways, and I don't think this even really counts as 1 in 20 wrong because the polls themselves have a pretty big miss, and that does hurt. Though I did learn some things, and I'm hoping that future kind of things like this are not going to be as big of an issue for my model, but we'll see. The other thing I want to touch on here in this part of the video before I talk about like what this election means for the future of Ontario is specifically my actual literal poll. Now, my actual literal poll I did is February 3rd to February 24th. So it's a pretty long 21-day survey period. So how does this chalk up? So this is what my actual data looks like. And if I go to... That's the wrong spreadsheet. If I go to this spreadsheet, I go to this. We can see how it compares. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna hide this. This is just math. That's not anything worth noting. So this, I'll get back to this one in a second, but do not take this highlighted row as like anything of significance. That's just to highlight that. Do not take that seriously. So this is how I perform. So if you ignore my highlighted poll, there's 6 pollsters who did better than me. Of the 13, myself included, in the province, I'm exactly the median pollster. Not bad, considering if we go to my actual article, and we see here, again, I'll zoom in just for the sake of reading. What do I have in my caveat here? I will caveat that I think my sample is biased in favor of the New Blue Party. I suspect the OLP, OPC will be higher than these numbers. And guess what? Guess what? What? The OLP and the OPC are higher than my numbers? Wow, is it almost like the pollster can tell when something's wrong with their data? And like, guess what? Who got the NDP correct almost spot on to the decimal place? Oh, I did. So what happened here at the New Blues? So it's pretty obvious to anyone who watches my channel, it seems, my political views. I don't try to pontificate too heavily on this because I don't actually care that much about telling you what I believe because I want to be correct about modeling things. People ask questions and I'll answer them, but like, I'm not here to tell you what politics to believe in. So, I have a very disproportionate number of people who watch my content and follow me on Twitter who are the kind of person who is a federal conservative voter who does not vote PC. And most of these people I don't think actually vote provincially. But because the option was in the poll, they said they're going to vote new blue, and I don't actually think most of them voted. Now, the people who actually answered my poll themselves might have literally voted, but the demographics they're representing don't actually vote. So what we get here with this edited version is I drop all of these most of these voters that I'm pretty sure will vote federally but won't vote provincially. And if I drop those people from my sample, this actually bumps me up 2 places. So now there's only 4 pollsters ahead of me in overall performance. And notably, I'm almost bang on for the PCs now. I'm about the same error on the NDP. My biggest remaining error is Green versus Liberal. And I'm still a little high on the New Blues and other. Because it seems like a lot of New Blue voters from 2021 or 2022 either defected PC or left the electorate. I think they left the electorate, but I'm not 100% certain. I would need to dive way more into it. So overall, I'm actually pretty satisfied with my polling. Like, yeah, I'm actually only average. But, average is not bad, considering these companies have way more funding, and I'm polling my audience of my YouTube channel that's actually partisan. My audience is partisan. I have liberals, and I have NDPers, and I have Greens in my audience. Like, you can see, I get that they respond. But, 45 people of the people I polled voted New Blue in 2022. Okay, guys. It happens. It happens. Or I have, a very, very large number of new voters who are voting New Blue. And it's well, clearly that didn't happen. Clearly that did not happen. But even then, you do enough weighting, you do enough statistics, you do enough math, and you can kind of make this stuff work. And I'm pretty satisfied, all things considered, with this as published. It's not the best poll in the world, but hey, it's my poll. And this does, in a sense, give me a lot more confidence on my federal numbers. Because the caveat with my federal numbers here, I'm just really side noting here, is I think I'm overestimating the Conservatives in the city of Toronto and underestimating the Liberals. And if that's the case, what I think this is actually province-wide is something like 44, 45 to 36, 37. That's what I would actually believe province-wide based on the actual provincial election result. I'm going to get into that. I have a video planned as an interim federally before the next actual update. But I have an interim video plan where I'm going to discuss some things. But yeah. So with that, let us discuss very briefly what this election outcome means for Ontario. So it seems that both Crombie and Stiles are staying on. Personally, I think Stiles should resign. She had a actually terrible performance. The party lost nearly 5 points of vote share, 4 seats. They only got lucky because strategic voting seems to have saved most of their seats. But that's not skill, that's just luck. It really is just luck. And there is no real obvious path here for the NDP to gain because they lost ground literally everywhere else. So they're not even in a situation like the Greens where they have some prospects they did pretty well in Perry San Muskoka. They did reasonably good, I think, in Bruce Grey, Owen Sound. I have to double check this, but I don't really care that much. So, but I digress. So what's going to happen here is since both Crombie and Stiles appear to be staying on, Doug Ford's going to win the 2029 election. I really don't see those two leaders changing their personalities, being different people, running different campaigns. Their 2029 campaign is probably going to be almost the same as this campaign. There might be some differences. Maybe Crombie will change her tax policies a little bit. Maybe Stiles will try to reach the working class voter better. Try to shore up her seats. And I will just note here, the PCs did gain ground in like all of the cities that I identified that they're gaining ground in. They gained ground in London. They gained ground in Niagara. They gained ground in Hamilton. The problem is the NDP gained more ground, so it didn't matter. But the NDP gained as many votes as the PCs gained in those seats. So despite the PCs gaining actually a lot of votes in those seats, as I correctly identified, the NDP gained as many. So that caught me off guard. But I was correct in that the PCs are picking up a lot of voters in those areas. So there really is not a very clear path. Like the only option here, in any meaningful sense of the term, is either the opposition, and there's some talks about this, comes to some like funky electoral pact thing where they mutually withdraw candidates in an attempt to defeat Ford. But I don't think that can possibly work because, and this is a big because here, I think voters will see right through that. Like, maybe they could do an 11th hour moment of it, but there's no way they can plan this 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in advance, and voters not just vote the way they want it anyways, knowing that. They know the Liberals and the NDP are going to make a coalition. They have the majority of seats. People will vote the way they want to get that government. So, I don't think that will be like a surefire way to win. Because again, I've said this before, and I'll say this again. The NDP has like 18 and a bit. The Liberals have like 30. Not every Liberal voter, not every NDP voter, wants the other party to govern. So, in a seat like Hamilton, we go down here, we discuss like Hamilton East Stony Brook, or Stony Creek. The Liberals withdrawing their candidate there probably doesn't change the result, because a lot of people who vote Liberal don't want an NDP government. If they wanted an NDP government, they would vote NDP. Like, there is absolutely an overlap in voters between the Liberals and the NDP. I would say you can safely assume 60 to 70% of Liberal voters would vote NDP, or vice versa. The problem is, if they collectively, let's round up for generosity here, collectively they have 49% of the vote. If they only get 70% of 49% of the vote, and Ford still gets 43% of the vote, well, 70% of 49 is 34, and that's a loss. Now, perhaps they might be able to surge. They could do, let's say, in some ridiculous universe, right, that the agreement, the coalition paperwork is so compelling that the Liberals and the NDP, two very different parties, Crombie and Stiles ran very different campaigns. Very different. They're not even like the federal NDP and the federal Liberals, which are more similar. The Crombie ran a very different campaign. But the universe where this coalition is so compelling that 90% of Liberals and 90% of NDPers will agree to vote with the other party. And the remaining 10%, well, we'll get to that in a second. That gives you 44% of the vote. So if that remaining 10% leave, they win. Ish. Or if even a little bit, even like 4% of them vote Ford, well, now you have 45 to 44, and Ford should win a slight PV lead. So this is the trick here. Yes, it is theoretically possible you could hoodwink the Ontario voter by last minute pulling something like this. But if people are aware of what is actually being proposed and what is actually going to happen and what is actually being discussed, they're going to vote accordingly. And the only meaningful way with the current vote share from the current campaigns would be to have, they would need to be retaining nearly 95% of their voters. And the reason why that is so silly and far-fetched to me is because, well, let's look here. The NDP, the Liberals lost 5% of their previous voters. The NDP lost 3% of their voters to the PCs already. Like, guys. And then they also lost another 1% to the Greens, another 3.4% to the Greens. So they each lost about 6% of their voters to other parties. There's just not a lot of room. If they get 94% retention, if the two parties merged or they mutually withdraw candidates, that gives them 46. Okay? That's not terrible, but it's not great because that they lost about, if you do the math here, and they get the same losses to the PCs, they lost 4% of their vote collectively from 2022 to 2025 to the PCs. They lose 4% again. That puts it at 45 to 46, which is razor thin. That means they have to have almost perfect 94% vote retention. And very few parties sustain this. It's very difficult. We'll go to the federal, because federal's a bit easier. But you look at federal, none of the parties in Ontario, except possibly the Conservatives, are retaining this. And I will note, with the Conservatives, they're only at 96% retention. And this is at a time when my poll is saying the Conservative vote share is increasing by nearly 12 points in Ontario. They're getting nearly 12 points, but they can only maintain a 96% retention. And frankly, as a pollster, as a modeler, as someone who studies elections and campaigning, this is probably a gross overestimation of the Conservative support. My audience probably skews more into people who are firm Conservative voters and less willing to defect. The defection rate in reality in Ontario is probably higher than this, especially if you count people who leave the electorate, which I do actually in these numbers. So there's not a lot of chance that the two parties in a weird coalition agreement will average a 96% retention. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely. And in the world where you're saying, okay, but what if they collectively gain voters? Okay, but if Ford is losing voters, he doesn't need to lose very many voters himself to change the course of the election. Or if a lot of new people turn out, that changes things quite significantly. But that's a different election. And I don't really see Crombie or Stiles or Schreiner in round 2 Shriner, I think it's round 4, getting a different outcome. But we'll see. We'll see. Well, that I bid you do, and I'll see you next week with something else.